Shawn, welcome. Lovely to see you.
Thank you. It's great to be here. I just saw Angelique's talk. That was terrific. Really enjoyed it.
Yeah, me too, big time. And I'm enjoying seeing you on the platform. And again, thank you so much for your time. I can see you set your language up. So I'm going to go into the shadow. Let me know when you need the slides. And it's all yours. Guys, let's greet Shawn with the fires as we customly do.
Put the slides on and we'll get going straight from that. That'll be great.
Awesome. Have a good one. Enjoy.
Thanks, Adam. Well, great to be here, everyone. Thanks for coming along. I was thinking that what I'm going to tell you is really about the use of stories that explain organizations' strategies. And it occurred to me that I probably did my first strategy story in 2009. It was for an organization called the Transport Accident Commission. And their CEO, Janet Dorr, was really keen to get her executive on the same page. And this is something you'll sort of see as a repeated pattern, this idea of how do you get everyone on the same page, understanding the strategy in a similar way so that they can communicate that in the organization. And it's kind of like cutting through that fog, using our lighthouse to cut through that fog. I guess the common challenge that we have is one I see quite often. And the last time I saw it was when I was in Kuala Lumpur. It was probably just a couple of months ago. I was working with a group of about 50 leaders from an Asia Pacific, global business. It was the Asia Pacific arm of that business. And they just sat down to listen to their head of strategy describe their strategy, right? And I'm sure you've gone through this experience where, they show you all the charts and all the data. And anyway, they explained that for 2 hours. And at the end of the 2 hours, right at the last slide, was the sort of strategic choices that this organization was going to make. And there was 3 of them. And then it was morning tea. And as people were having morning tea, I was milling around because my session started after morning tea. I could hear people sort of say how overwhelmed they felt, how there was just so much data that they didn't really know what to make of it all. It was confusing. They were in the fog. And this was really proven to me when we got started. I broke the group up into about 6 or 7 different smaller groups. And I put this sort of a little fold out of a story structure on the wall for each of the groups. And the story structure is simply, in the past it was like this, and then something happened. And so now we're doing this, like this is where their strategic choices go. So in the future, it can be like that. And as I walked around the room, I realized that only one group could remember what their strategic choices were. One group out of 7. And guess what? Who was in that group? Yes, the head of strategy. So everyone else was confused about the 2-hour presentation. So I had to go around and actually remind each group, these are the 3 strategic choices. And once they did it, they sort of went, oh, okay. And then they started building their story to explain that. This happens over and over again. And it's only when they start to work out the story that explains their choices that they really understand the choices, okay? Now, I like to think of it as a little bit like a rope, sort of sitting on a deck of a boat, for example. And when it's all sort of tangled, if you had your leadership team at one end and your frontline workers at the other end, and they say the leadership team moved their rope, there would be no feeling at the other end from the front line. So what we need to do metaphorically is to tighten the rope, right? Tighten the rope so that, a move by the executive, a new message is heard and felt by the front line, and vice versa, by the way. So the same thing goes up that line. And that's what we're trying to do with this idea of a strategy story. So what I'm planning to do in my session is simply share with you some of the lessons I've learned. I'm going to show you how we do these strategy stories, and then share some of the lessons I've learned along the way. And hopefully that will help you have a go. And I'm just thinking, I saw Angelina show her book. I thought I'll show you mine, because in putting stories to work, I describe very clearly how you go about doing that. In fact, I notice here, if you want the Mandarin version of the book, you can get that as well. So anyway, that's just by the by. Now, I want to show a little video. I'm going to ask Artem to show it. It's a little animation. It was done a long time ago. And all I want you to do is look at this animation and just think what you think is happening. Try to work out what you think is happening in this animation. So Artem, do you want to get that video going? There's no sound to this. Okay, so that's our video. So just type in the chat window what you thought was happening in that video. What I've noticed is that the sort of general response I get is that people give me different stories. People sort of say, oh, there was a boy coming to the door asking to go out with the daughter, and the father's not very happy, and that was one interaction. Or maybe some children were playing and the mother is trying to get them to come in the house and they're not coming in. But here's the thing, when people see that video, they nearly always tell themselves a little story to explain what's going on. And the problem, this is the researchers who did this really came to the conclusion, and that's what we do when we see anything that's unpredictable, we don't quite understand what's happening, we will tell ourselves a story, because the stories help us be safe. If you have a story, you can kind of predict what's going to happen next. Okay, and in an organization, if your leadership is not telling the story, what are your people doing? Well, they're telling their own stories, right? And unfortunately, they'll all be different. So part of the exercise, part of you trying to do here is to try to get people on that same page, telling a similar story, right? And that's your strategy story. Now, if you pop the slides back up, Artem, I'll jump into my next idea. Thank you. Now, I'll just jump past that. I guess the thing that I'm thinking about whenever I'm doing a strategy story is that it's a change exercise, right? You have your stories, your strategy story, which is your big overarching story. You have to give people skills. You've got to help them find and tell stories. And as Angelina pointed out, you need story listening skills as well as storytelling skills. And of course, I find you need to embed stories of progress. This actually has phenomenal motivational impact on your people if you can show them where the strategy is working, Okay, so you have to do that on an ongoing and continuous basis. You got to embed those stories. So the way we do it is really just over 4 steps. There's a preparation phase. It's really trying to get an understanding of the strategy. It's always in all sorts of different formats, and it may not even exist, actually. That's something that we noticed. Then there's the process of crafting the story, the strategy story, and you do that with the executive team or a broader group. The largest group I've done it with is 100 of the top people in an organization, big insurance company, and that works really well because then you've got 100 people owning that story. The connection is then about helping people tell that story in their own way, in their own words, using their own anecdotes. Okay, and when that happens, they get ownership, and it's authentic. It's an authentic telling of the strategy. And then finally, as I said, embedding the stories is vital. You've got to embed the progress stories, stories of progress. Now, this process could take 12 months, 18 months. The first, first 3 steps you could probably do in 6 to 8 weeks, right? But the embedding process takes some time. And the results can be just phenomenal. With that insurance company, their engagement scores jumped 7 points, right? Which is kind of unheard of in a large insurance company, that a 7-point jump in engagement scores put down primarily to the improvement of how they communicated their strategy. So let's just jump into each of these areas, and I'll just talk about some of the things that I've seen, if you like. I mean, the first one is the fact that many organizations lack a strategy, right? I remember having a call from a head of a strategy company in the Netherlands, large global business. I asked them, okay, send me your strategy. And they said, well, it's not only in one place. And then I said, that's okay, just send me what you've got. Well, it's not quite written down. And then you discover this multi-billion-dollar company does not have a strategy, right? And in fact, the strategy story process can help them out. They can actually use that to work out what their strategy is, and that's what we end up doing with that group. The second part that I see over and over again is just the lack of choices, right? For example, they might have a strategy which sort of says, we're going to focus on our people, right? And I use a technique, I just call it the Costanza technique. I don't know if you've seen the TV series Seinfeld, but one of the characters in this, George Costanza, he's a character where everything goes wrong in his life. And then in one episode, he decides to do the opposite. And in doing the opposite, all of a sudden everything goes right, until in the end it goes wrong. But for the most part, doing the opposite. And I thought to myself, that's kind of what you have to test out. You have to have a real opposite. So when someone says to me, oh, look, we're going to really focus on our people, I sort of ask them, well, were you really going to not focus on your people? Was that the choice? You're thinking, you're really weighing it up that we're not going to focus on our people or we're going to focus on our people? No, it's not a choice. I said, you've got to have real choices. Choices where, hey, we're going to outsource overseas or we're going to keep it here, in country. Choices that are real, things that people are balancing out. And that make good stories, because as soon as you have a real choice, everyone wants to know why. Why are we doing that? And that's what the strategy story helps with. In the crafting stage, as I sort of mentioned, there's the story structure, in the past, then something happened. So now, in the future, this is the final element. It's a simple story structure. It's a pattern. And the important thing is that people do this together as groups. Okay. And just like I had that fold out on the wall, you want to get small teams or even bigger groups to actually co-create their story and use that story pattern. As I said, you'll find out all about that in putting stories to work. We tend to then create materials for learning the stories. We call it a story canvas. And then it's about getting people aligned, right? As I said right at the outset, Janet Dorr was looking, the CEO of Transport Accident Commission was looking at getting her people aligned. That was a key element. and doing it together helps that. But the second thing which we've discovered over and over is it's so important to keep your strategy story oral, right? You want to resist writing it down for as long as you can so that people can hear the telling of the story as opposed to a written story. There's a difference between a written story and an oral story. A written story is kind of more formal. A written story tends to use larger words. Oral story, simple words. There's rhyme, there's multiplications, there's repetition. Those types of things actually help oral stories. So they do feel a little bit different. And you want to keep this in an oral format as long as possible. That's why we record the stories and send the stories out as recordings. Now, I guess the third element, connecting, right, is vital. And the way I like to think of it is that you build this broad story, which we call the original score, right? It's like the overarching story for everyone to learn, but then everyone has their own personal arrangement, right? And depending on your style, you might have something that sounds more like jazz or something like classical. It is really your personality comes through in the telling. And that happens because you're sharing your own anecdotes, okay? So that's really the important element we've learned over and over again in connecting the stories. And another thing that we've learned is that you can't tell the story, fully every time, right? People get bored of hearing the same stories. So you need to be able to just tell threads of the story, just things that describe one of the choices, some sub-elements of the story, little anecdotes that illustrate it, that people remember are part of the bigger story. So you have to tell it in lots and lots of different ways because, as we all know, we get quickly bored of the story told the same way over and over again. And then finally, now this normally is a slide that actually animates and nicely illustrates my point here, but I think it's just been flattened out into one slide. But if you can sort of see, if you can just focus on the smaller circles, this is the embedding process. So you can imagine there's a funnel at the top. These are your stories of the strategy actually happening, those progress stories I was telling you about. What you want to do is build a system whereby someone in the organization is selecting compelling stories and they're sharing it out with teams across your organization. They're talking about their story. They're having a conversation. They're talking about what they like about the story. How have they seen that sort of thing happen in their organization? This is the real, sort of hard work, but where a lot of the value comes, right? Then they might be inspired by that story to try something themselves, in which case, once they've done it and they've got some success, they can then submit that back up into the funnel, right? And it's this continuous ongoing process of stories being found in your organization and then retold. And just to give you a little example, Commonwealth Bank is Australia's largest bank. Their retail part of the bank is about 70,000 people. And they were facing a problem, right? A few years back in 2018, we had a Royal Commission into banking and insurance. And in that period, they realized that the front line, people in the banking branches, were given incentives to sell different products. They were being paid to sell products. So if someone was in to open an account, the people in the front line would try to sell them some insurance because they would get directly compensated for selling them in the insurance, right? They quickly realized this was a bad setup because it created poor behavior. So they got rid of all the frontline incentives, and the bank was really worried that their revenues might reduce. And so they engaged Anecdote to help them replace their explicit reward system with an implicit system, right? One where people just felt good about the work that they were doing. You know, they were getting internal reward from their own behavior. And it came about by every week, their manager, the branch manager, would get their team together and they would talk about how they had impact on their customers, right? They would talk about specific instances. And the 4 things that they did is that they would, first of all, share a story of something that happened last week. Then people would be asked questions like, so what's significant about this story? You know, and people would jump in and say, well, you know, that's significant because, you know, Jill would not have been able to do that unless she'd done the, you know, the training that enabled her to do it. And then someone else might jump in and say, yeah, but you see how she had support from her boss, and that enabled it to happen. And so through this conversation, they're working out how to make customer impact occur in their business. Then they might ask questions like, so have we ever seen anything like this in our part of the business? Or, you know, how can we do more of this? And they would come up with ideas to do more of that. And this would generate not only possibilities, but give them insight and confirmation that they were having a big difference. It was so interesting listening to the change in conversation as they did this project. It went from a very transactional view of their customers to one which was to do with a relational view. They would say things about their customers, about their business and what they were trying to do and how they were trying to get their work done and how they were helping them. As before, they were talking about what products they were selling them. It was so different, the change in mindset. And they also saw a great increase in engagement. They saw an increase in their revenue, their profits maintained through that period, all while they thought they were going to have a massive reduction. It's still used today. They put their customer impact stories up on the Yammer network, and it is just a core element of what this company does. Stories are told on a daily basis, and it's a big part of what they do. So that's what you can do, and it's at all different levels in organizations. We've been creating these strategy stories for 15 years now, all around the world for all sorts of different types of companies. But these lessons that I've shared with you happen over and over again. And I think that's the thing that we're really proud to sort of see, that we're learning along the way ourselves, right, on how to do this well. So that's probably where I'll finish it, except that I wanted to leave you with this quote by Bill Murray. And I think it's a lovely one. He says, you have to hear stories and you have to live stories. You have to have a bunch of experiences and be able to say, here's something that happened to me yesterday. And if you can make people laugh or feel anything by telling them what happened to you, then you're just telling the story well. And I think that's great advice, something that I think we should all live by. So I think that's where I want to finish, Artem, and open to questions, and we can do a bit of Q&A if you like.
Thank you so much. I'm always inspired by how you put so much wisdom and content with such a clear pace in a limited amount of time. This was awesome.
I'm helping you catch up time, mate.
That's right. No. Thank you for that. Appreciate it as a host. All right. So while we're waiting for the questions, Shawn, I have one of my own. You just shared the structure with in the past and this part where the strategy is a result of a story we lived through. What I encounter in the companies I work with is that, for instance, I had this company who rolled out an HR strategy. It was like a list of paper. First of all, it was very abstract, but that's for Mark to answer about. But they were really not into talking about how they formed the strategy and how they came to the idea that the strategy is something that is reacting to the change around them. They just say, okay, now we do this. How can we approach such people to get them inspired about talking about the past when they don't see it fit?
Yeah, I sometimes hear that from my customers as well, where they sort of say, look, we don't want to look at the past. We just want to look at the future, and you see that. Yeah. And what I have to explain to them is that everyone is viewing the future based on experiences they've had in the past. And to explain to them why they should be doing this new thing, you have to explain the forces in process. What were the economic changes? What were the competitive changes? What were the leadership changes? Is there been a new, if no one's talking about, for example, AI in HR at the moment, right? It'd be crazy for them to not mention that as something that's just happened and it's going to affect the HR world, right? So it's getting them to understand that. You don't have to go way back in history, but you have to go far enough back to understand what's making you change. So that's what I go through and tell them. And they seem to get it eventually, especially when they've crafted the story and they start telling it and they see the response. That's the big change.
So I hear two parts in this. First, just demonstrating that principle and some other examples, and then just giving them a trial. That's, I guess, the best recipe for any new method. Yeah, awesome.
It is, and getting them a trial, I think, is important because they don't really understand it. It is a new thing, that's for sure. Yeah.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. All right. One more question from me. If we don't see any in the chat, just please add some more if people will write later. I know that a part of, in the recent years, a big part of a strategy was to cut costs and to optimize. Well, instead of saying fire people, they say optimize. Yeah. And I always get leaders coming to me and they say, well, how do we tell a story about that? How do we sugarcoat it with a story? So what would be your response to them? And that's true.
Yeah. Well, I personally think it's always the best policy is to be transparent and tell people, what's going on and why tough decisions are being made. And they like to be talked to as human beings and adults. And yes, the message might be a tough message, but they know they've not been lied to, I think, is the important thing. So that's the important thing in that type of conversation. I think the other thing is the strategies that I see tend to be generative strategies, though, these days. Like they're talking about, the growth, the new direction, the things they want to build. So it's a lot easier to tell that type of strategy than a downsizing strategy, as you can imagine.
Yeah, that's true, because that's a positive input. And let me get to you on that. So you tell that to a leader, which I totally respect, talking to people like adults. But then they say, what about the risks? I mean, what if our
everyone
top manager comes out and says...
Yeah, that's right. Well, because they might say, but people might walk out the door. They might resign, if, under the, concern that, they're going to get fired. And I hear that. But here's the thing. You've got two choices, right? Your leaders can either operate ethically and transparently and people will lose their jobs, right? That's option one. Or they can lie their way to it and people will lose their jobs, right? What's the long-term story people will be telling? If you're going to lose jobs, you might as well do it in a way that's robust, that you can go to sleep at night because you've done the best possible thing you can do. You've tried your best for your people. You've looked at all the options and possibilities. But, it's come to a situation where you just have to be straight down the line and honest, because the rebuild, right? You'll still have people who went through the dishonesty and the firing. And what stories have they got? So it's a lose-lose. The option one is a lose-lose scenario, unfortunately.
That's true. From what you're saying, I remember last year David Hutchins shared this question: what story would you be telling about the things you're doing right now in the future? This question, just like the one you've shared now, is like, it's generative. So you're thinking about the story you'll be telling about these events in the long term, and that defines what you do in the short term. So thank you. I love the resonance and the answer. Awesome. So Shawn, we're coming to the closure here, and we still have a minute for the tradition.
Oh,
so
good.
A lighthouse can show us where the danger is, but a group of lighthouses can guide us through the dangerous waters. So what story would you like to see more people tell these days to make the world brighter?
So I've just come off an experimental program that we developed, which was 6 weeks of 90 minutes, no slides, no coaching. All it consists of was people telling stories, listening to stories, and talking about stories. And it was the most fascinating experience because two things I walked away from that. And this is the sort of story I think we need to be telling. And it's not a topic that I'm going to give you, but rather a type. And that is, it's going back to the small stories. And I think this is probably a good lead into Mark's talk around, the everyday story. But I'm totally with him on this, and he'll expand on that, obviously. But the small stories, but also, from our previous speaker, the ability to notice stories, the story listening element is, I know this is something I wrote about back in, when I first started in 2004 about story listening, right? And it's only now starting to get a little momentum. But in those early days, that's what Anecdote did. We would go into organizations and collect hundreds and hundreds of stories to work out, behaviors, and then work with people based on that story listening exercise. So I think it's a fundamental skill, story listening and small stories, put them together. That will navigate you through the lighthouses, give you that new safe pathway, I think.
Love it. Thank you so much. I like that you're not focusing on a specific theme, but the small stories, and that's a great cue for our next speaker. But for a second here, guys, let's give our fires to Shawn for this amazing presentation. Very practical and wise as always. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks for coming along and listening.
Yeah, and the fires are
coming. Really appreciate it.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Shawn.
You're welcome. Have a great conference.
Thank you. All right. That was awesome. Thanks. And fires are coming into the chat. And we are moving to our last speaker of the morning.